Hello and welcome back. This video is going to be talking about all the different characters in Risk of Rain 2, their abilities, and their strengths and weaknesses. Now, I want to mention this up front. All of the characters in this game are viable. Don't worry about which characters are quote-unquote the best. All of the characters in this game are very much playable and worth a try. Generally, the most important aspect of your run is going to be the items you get. That's why I wanted to cover the items before anything else. Obviously, some characters are going to be better than others, but you can pick any character you like and do perfectly fine with them. There's plenty of variety among the cast of this game, so play who fits your playstyle best. As far as which abilities you pick, however, there are some instances where there's a clear winner, but for the most part it's up to personal preference. I'll explain the pros and cons of each so you can decide for yourself which you want to try out, and I'll also include the loadout I use for each character when we get to them in case you can't decide. That's about it for the intro, so let's take a look at the characters. First up, of course, is the Commando. The Commando is your typical shoot-'em-up style character and is a pretty well-rounded character for the most part. While he doesn't have the highs of some of the other characters, he doesn't really share any of their lows either. As you'd expect from the first character you can play, he's a great character for newer players to get a grasp of the game, but he still has appeal to veterans as well. He's strongest at close to mid-range, and his base kit doesn't handle larger crowds as well as some of the others can, but he doesn't require that many items to help him out in that regard. His primary attack is Double Tap. It's a straightforward attack that shoots twice for 90% damage each. His default secondary attack is called Phase Round, which fires a piercing bullet that deals 300% damage on a 3-second cooldown. And his alternate secondary is Phase Blast, which fires 2 shotgun blasts that deal 8 times 200% damage, and is also on a 3-second cooldown. As you'd expect from a shotgun blast, Phase Blast is strongest at close range and pretty weak to mid to long range. That being said, this is one of those examples of one clearly being better than the other. While Phase Round can pierce, it's hard to deny how much stronger Phase Blast is. Phase Blast really just amps up Commando's single target damage a lot, while Phase Round currently doesn't bring much of value to the table comparatively. His default utility is Tactical Dive, which does a quick roll straight in whichever direction you're moving when used, and his alternate utility is Tactical Slide, which, as it sounds, does a combat slide. Tactical Slide not only allows you to change your direction while sliding, but also allows you to keep firing, unlike Tactical Dive. You can even use some abilities mid-slide. The downside of Tactical Slide is that instead of doing the same thing in the air like Tactical Dive does, you do a tiny little hop, which is not nearly as helpful. While this one is still somewhat a matter of preference, I highly recommend using Tactical Slide. You have a lot of freedom when it comes to the movement during your slide, and you don't have to sacrifice your DPS in the meantime. If you really don't like the way it works in the air though, Tactical Dive is still solid enough as pure mobility. His default special is Suppressive Fire, which fires 6 shots that each deal 100% damage and stun, and his alternate special is Frag Grenades, which has 2 charges and deals 175% damage and deals 4 times damage at the center of the explosion. Your choice of special is definitely up to you. These are both good options for different reasons. Suppressive Fire actually scales with your attack speed, so you can get much more than just 6 shots. It's very good for single target DPS and works very well with items due to its scaling with attack speed, and each individual shot has a 1.0 proc coefficient. Frag Grenades, on the other hand, is a bit of the opposite. While it's not as good for single target DPS, it gives Commando some decent AoE damage. Hitting an enemy at the center of the explosion is also the only way Commando can proc the bans now without having other items, so it has that going for single target DPS as well. Personally, I use Phase Blast, Tactical Slide, and Suppressive Fire. While this doesn't give me many tools to deal with crowds by default, it's not too hard to come by items that will help you circumvent that, so I never really find it to be an issue personally. Next we have the Huntress. The Huntress is also pretty straightforward gameplay-wise, but don't confuse that for not being worthwhile. While she does have the lowest HP scaling of all the characters, she makes up for it in agility, damage output, and versatility. She is a very solid character all around and is probably one of the strongest characters currently. Her only real weakness is her fragility, but you can easily overcome that once you get the hang of her. Unlike the Commando, she actually has two different primaries, both of which have auto-aim. Her default primary is Strafe, which fires a 150% damage projectile every half second. And her alternate primary is Flurry, which fires 3 100% damage projectiles every 1.3 seconds. And when you get a crit, it actually fires 6 projectiles instead of 3. So you essentially deal 4 times the damage on a crit instead of double. Her primary is up to preference. Strafe is a bit more versatile and doesn't have a wind-up like Flurry does, and actually has higher DPS overall initially, but Flurry actually surpasses it with enough crit. Only 20% actually, and has substantially higher DPS once you reach 100%. It's really up to you. If you feel as if you aren't getting enough crit in your runs, and or you just want some more consistent damage early on, go for Strafe. If you want what will eventually give you the highest DPS possible, go for Flurry. Her secondary is Laser Glaive. Like her primaries, Laser Glaive actually auto-aims and bounces to up to 6 targets, with each successive hit dealing 10% more damage than the last. Laser Glaive, in my opinion, is one of the strongest secondary abilities in the game. It is a very good crowd clearing option, and has always been one of the best parts of the Huntress's kit. Her default utility is Blink, which is a quick teleport a fair distance forward, and her alternate utility is Phase Blink, which teleports you a much shorter distance forward, but has a much shorter cooldown and can store up to 3 charges to compensate. This is another one that's up to preference. Blink teleports you much further, and is actually able to move vertically, so it's better for moving around the map, but it isn't quite as versatile in combat. Phase Blink, on the other hand, due to the shorter cooldown and additional charges, is very good at dodging in combat. The drawback being that you miss out on the distance and the verticality of the default Blink. Her default special is Arrow Rain, which teleports you into the sky and creates an AoE at a targeted location, damaging and slowing enemies in the radius. And her alternate special is Ballista, which also teleports you into the sky, but instead lets you fire off 3 high power shots that each deal 900% damage. Now, most people will tell you there's not much of a contest here. Ballista is far superior to Arrow Rain in its current state. Sure, Arrow Rain can damage crowds, but not only is the radius really small, and the slow is pretty insignificant, even if an enemy stands perfectly still in the AoE for the whole duration, it still only does 2090% damage in total to that enemy. Ballista does 2700% in total. Keep in mind, Huntress also doesn't need the tiny bit of extra crowd control because of her access to Laser Glaive. Ballista gives her a much needed boost to her single target DPS, and you can even switch up your target between each shot if needed. Personally, I use either Strafe or Flurry depending on how I'm feeling, Phase Blink, and Ballista. If I'm specifically going straight to fight the final boss, I'll use Strafe, because that is her most versatile loadout without items. But if I'm planning on looping it all, I'll use Flurry, because it's much more likely that Flurry will be able to surpass Strafe. Either way you cut it, Huntress is a very solid character, unless you use Arrow Rain. Next up is MUL-T, who is probably the most mechanically unique character in the game. He has the highest health scaling out of every character in the game, and actually has 12 passive armor, which comes out to a 10.71% damage reduction. He does also have the lowest damage stat in the game, but the damage his primaries can do makes up for it. Oh yes, you heard me right, I did say primaries. His special allows him to swap between 2 different primary attacks of your choice, and he also has 2 equipment slots that he switches between as well, which makes MUL-T the only character in the game that can carry multiple equipments. Now, MUL-T's already probably starting to sound pretty busted, but those strengths are picking up the slack of the rest of his kit, which is rather lacking. His secondary and utility are rather weak, as I'll explain later, and he's also very vulnerable, which is why he has the extra health and armor. Starting with his primaries, he has 4 in total, and you can pick any combination of 2, even 2 of the same one if you want. His first primary is Auto Nail Gun, which as it sounds is a close to mid-range minigun that fires in a corkscrew pattern, and when you stop firing it fires out a blast of 12 shots, and has a brief wind down before it can be fired again. Auto Nail Gun has a DPS of roughly 840% at base, which is pretty high. Its only real weakness is its range, since it's fairly inaccurate, and about mid-range it starts to experience damage fall off, but it's still very powerful. His secondary primary is Rebar Puncher, which fires a piercing 600% damage projectile in a straight line and has a brief reload after firing. Rebar Puncher acts as MUL-T's tool for long-range damage, as well as a bit of crowd control if enemies are clumped together. While it does have very high single-shot damage, which makes it very good for proc chains and the bans, its overall DPS is fairly low. But it does have a rather interesting niche. If you take Rebar Puncher in both primary slots, the time it takes to swap between your primaries with your special is actually shorter than the reload, so you can fire, swap, and so on for some pretty high damage output. This does require some micro and timing, and it's not super crazy or anything, so you aren't missing out on much by not doing it, but it can be pretty fun. His third primary is Scrap Launcher, which personally I think is his most underwhelming option. It's essentially a rocket launcher that deals 360% damage that can hold up to 4 charges. Like the Visions of Heresy, it will start recharging when not firing, and all 4 charges will be recharged at the same time. So it's most efficient to use all 4 at the same time so you don't accidentally fire another just before it comes off cooldown and end up wasting your own time. Now, even though I said I think it's the most underwhelming, I still don't think it's bad by any means. It has a decent explosion radius and projectile speed, but the shortcoming comes from the falloff of the splash damage. Any enemy that doesn't get directly hit only takes a quarter of the damage, which isn't terrible, but it's somewhat lackluster compared to other crowd controlling options in the game. That, and it doesn't benefit nearly as much from attack speed as his other primaries do due to the cooldown charge mechanic. Still, like I said, not bad, so take it if you want to try it out for yourself. I've just found it to be pretty underwhelming when compared to all of his other primaries, which are all pretty strong. Speaking of which, his last primary is Power Saw, which just gives MUL-T a chainsaw essentially. If Auto Nail Gun wasn't close enough range for you, now MUL-T has a melee option. It deals 100% damage 10 times every second for a whopping 1000% damage per second. And it even has a 1.0 proc coefficient, so this thing's proc rate is nuts. The only real reason you wouldn't want to take it is simply that it's melee only. Remember when I said MUL-T is very vulnerable? He doesn't have the tools the other melee characters do to comfortably stay in melee range, so it's pretty risky. But hey, that's the name of the game, isn't it? His secondary is Blast Canister, which throws out a bomb that stuns and explodes into 4 smaller bombs. As I mentioned briefly in my items video, stuns aren't super amazing in this game. Lots of enemies are immune to stuns, and at best it will briefly interrupt an enemy's attack animation before they go right back to shooting at you. Of course, it's still nice to have on hand, but I honestly think this is the weakest secondary skill in the game. The damage itself even is pretty underwhelming and inconsistent. But it's the only option MUL-T's got right now. Same goes for his utility skill, Transport Mode. This essentially turns MUL-T into a little car briefly as he zooms around, giving you a lot of armor, and you can even ram into enemies. So why is it bad? Well, if you hit a bigger enemy, which aren't very hard to come by the further you go, you'll bounce off it and the transformation will stop entirely, which can easily lead to a lot of unfavorable situations. You also can't jump while in transport mode, so it can be pretty restrictive compared to the rest of the survivor's utilities. Overall, it's pretty much only good as a getaway. But like I said, it's all MUL-T's got right now. And as previously discussed, his special is Retool, which allows you to swap back and forth between your primaries and your equipments. Personally, I like to take Auto Nail Gun in my first slot, and Rebar Puncher in the second. I think Auto Nail Gun is MUL-T's best primary. Very high DPS, very high proc rate, decent range, it's just solid. Rebar Puncher on the other hand is nice to have in the back to help you out with your range. It's also MUL-T's highest single shot damage, so it can lead to some pretty strong proc chains as well as synergizing very well with crowbars and the bans. I wouldn't recommend using it as your main source of damage, but it's nice to treat it as almost a pseudo-secondary ability. Before 1.0, I'd have considered MUL-T to be the weakest character in the game, but he finally got the love he needed and he's in a really good spot now. Next up we have everyone's favorite mushroom addicted character, the Engineer. The Engineer is a slower, more methodical character than the rest. His playstyle revolves around placing turrets that inherit your items to help you out in battle. He's very good at locking down and controlling areas, which makes him a very valuable asset during teleporter events specifically. He's a very strong character in multiplayer because of this, and he's also fantastic for dealing with the void fields. He's definitely slower and more vulnerable than the rest of the characters because he lacks a movement ability, but his power more than makes up for it. I mean, you've essentially got two little versions of you running around with all your items. It's hard to deny the strength of that. He's also got slightly higher HP scaling than the average character, which also compensates for his vulnerability a little bit. His primary is bouncing grenades, which charges up to 8 grenades that each deal 100% damage. While his primary isn't by any means weak, it's pretty unpopular due to it being his primary source of damage, other than his turrets, and it having to charge up before you can fire it. It's also got an arc, so anything further than mid-range is very difficult to hit. I don't mind his primary as much as a lot of other people do, but it's not hard to see why people aren't a huge fan of it, even if it's not bad objectively. His default secondary is pressure mines, which lets you lay down up to 4 mines that will explode when approached, dealing 900% damage if fully armed. His alternate secondary is spider mines, which only do 600% damage but don't have to arm themselves and will actively chase down enemies that walk into their radius. I think most people would tell you that spider mines are pretty much just better than pressure mines. While pressure mines do have a higher potential damage, having to set them down and wait for them to arm, and then hope that an enemy walks over the tiny radius is not the best. Having the higher instant damage from spider mines as well as them seeking out enemies makes them much more desirable. His default utility is Bubble Shield, which places down a spherical shield where you're standing for 15 seconds. While enemies can still walk into the shield, any enemy on the outside will not be able to hit you. This makes it very helpful for protecting you or your turrets if you have the stationary ones. The biggest problem Bubble Shield has is it's pretty small, and you yourself cannot shoot through it if you're on the outside. I'm serious, try it. If you're on the outside, your grenades will bounce right off, and your mines will actually just stick to the shield. It won't screw you over super often or anything, but it can be pretty annoying. His alternate utility is Thermal Harpoons, which allows you to lock on to a target and fire up to 4 homing missiles that each deal 500% damage. Thermal Harpoons is a very helpful offensive skill, especially against flying enemies, which the Engineer really struggles with normally if you don't have your turrets around for whatever reason. It also gives the Engineer a long-range damage option, which is something he normally lacks. And now for the main event, the turrets. His default special is the TR-12 Gauss Auto Turret, which places a stationary turret that fires a cannon roughly 3 times a second for about 90% damage. His alternate special is the TR-58 Carbonizer Turret, which places a mobile turret that fires a laser that slows enemies by 50% and deals about 200% damage per second. His turrets are really up to you, but I recommend his default. While not having to replace your turrets constantly while you're traversing a stage is definitely a plus, the default turrets are just much stronger overall, especially when you factor in items. Keep in mind, your turrets, default or mobile, inherit all the items you had when you placed them. The default turrets not only have a higher damage output, but they also have a higher proc coefficient, so they just scale with your items way better. That doesn't even include the, Bungus. Since the default turrets don't move, they just have full uptime on the bustling fungus, which essentially turns them into little healing stations that can easily sustain you and themselves. This is even further exacerbated if you get a rejuvenation rack or god forbid a Nukahana's opinion, the latter of which essentially becomes your turret's primary attack with how much you'll be pumping those skulls out. Personally, I like to take spider mines, thermal harpoons, and the stationary turrets. Spider mines and thermal harpoons allow me to hold my own against monsters and keep me on the move, while I can leave my stationary turrets around to help me out or cover areas I'm not in while I'm exploring a stage, and still retain their higher strength for the teleporter. I think this loadout gives you all of Engineer's best strengths all in one. Next up is the Artificer. The Artificer's playstyle revolves around large amounts of burst damage, with the drawback of having to juggle her cooldowns optimally to play her, as all of her abilities are on a cooldown. Yes, that's right, that includes her primary attack. Personally, I don't know if this is a hot take or not, I find the Artificer to be the most underwhelming character right now, as every other character that needed a little love in 1.0 got what they needed except for her, and every other character was basically already in a good spot. She just doesn't feel like she scales as well into the late game as the other characters generally do, needing even more specific items than most to make up for her shortcomings. Despite that, like I said at the beginning, she's still very much viable and can be a lot of fun. I just think she needs a little more attention to be in a good spot in the next patch. Anyways, let's actually look at her kit. For a start, she has a passive, which allows her to hover if you hold the jump button while you're in the air. You do still slowly descend while hovering, but it adds a lot to her base mobility. It helps a lot with dodging, moving around the stage more freely, and even dealing with some flying enemies more consistently. Now for her primaries, the first of which is Flame Bolt, which fires a small AoE projectile that does 220% damage and ignites enemies. Her alternate primary is Plasma Bolt, which fires a projectile with a slightly larger AoE that also does 220% damage but doesn't ignite. They both have 4 charges and have a cooldown of 1.3 seconds, which only restores 1 charge at a time. Personally, I find Plasma Bolt to be a bit redundant, because all of her other abilities have enough crowd control already, so the extra single target damage with the burn appeals to me a bit more. Her default secondary is Charge Nano Bomb, which allows you to slowly charge an arcing projectile that deals anywhere from 400% to 2000% damage in a solid area. It also fires sparks at enemies nearby that deal 1/5 of the bomb's total damage as it flies by them. Her alternate secondary is Cast Nano Spear, which allows you to slowly charge a linear piercing projectile that deals anywhere from 400% to 1200% damage, but it also freezes enemies. Frozen enemies that are brought below 30% of their HP are instantly executed. This one is up to you. Nano Bomb is great for dealing with nearby crowds given its high damage and AoE, but isn't as great for higher health targets despite its higher potential damage since it lacks the execute from freezing enemies. It's also less effective for dealing with flying enemies due to the arc. Nano Spear on the other hand is still alright for crowds due to its pierce, and the execute works wonders for dealing with beefier targets like Elderly Murians, Clay Templars, Elites, etc. But it's less consistent with crowds and has less damage against bosses specifically, since bosses can't be frozen. Her utility is Snap Freeze, which summons a wall of frozen pillars that each deal 100% damage and freeze enemies on contact. This freeze works the exact same way as the freeze from Nano Spear, so if you don't have Nano Spear on you or it's on cooldown, you still have access to this for a quick execute. Her default special is Flamethrower, which does exactly what it sounds like it does. Flamethrower deals 22 ticks of 95% damage over 3 seconds, and each tick has a 50% chance to burn, meaning it deals a staggering 4,295% damage in total on average. Also, each of those 22 ticks has a 1.0 proc coefficient, meaning Flamethrower will proc your items like crazy on top of its already insanely high base damage. Flamethrower is amazing for single targets and crowds alike, and is one of the strongest parts of Artificer's kit, which is unfortunate for Ion Surge, her alternate special. Ion Surge deals a quick burst of 800% damage around you and launches you into the sky, and that's about it. You can use it in midair, meaning if you combine it with her passive, you can basically never touch the ground, but you're still somewhat slow and vulnerable in the air. I find it to be safer on the ground, sprinting and jumping around most of the time rather than being stuck in a slow descent. While it's definitely not bad, it's severely outperformed by Flamethrower 9 times out of 10. Personally, I like to use Flame Bolt, Nano Spear, and Flamethrower. I think this is her most consistently powerful loadout, and I find myself coming back to it over any other combination. Similarly to Commando, I like to take the options best catered to single target DPS, as area damage items aren't very hard to come by in this game. Next up is everyone's favorite swordsman, the Mercenary. The Mercenary is our first true melee character. His playstyle revolves around staying up close and personal while also being hard to hit by means of high mobility and invincibility frames, or just iframes for short. After 1.0 with his new exposed debuff, The Mercenary has a pretty decent skill floor, which mostly revolves around knowing when and how to chain his abilities together, but he's still not super complex, so don't let that scare you if you're looking to try him out. First up, the Mercenary also has a passive, which is simply just a passive double jump. This alone gives him quite a bit of mobility over the rest of the cast, but he's got plenty of other tools for movement, as we'll see later. His primary attack is Laser Sword, which is just a basic sword slash in front of him. However, every third hit has a larger AoE and applies a debuff called Expose. If an enemy is hit while it's exposed, that hit will do an additional 350% damage, as well as reduce your active cooldowns by 1 second. This also removes the debuff, so it isn't as broken as it might sound at first, but it's still very strong. His default secondary is Whirlwind, which does 2 quick horizontal slices around you for 200% damage each, as well as pushing you forward a bit. If you use Whirlwind in the air, the slices are vertical and it performs a short hop instead. His alternate secondary is Rising Thunder, which performs an uppercut which sends you into the air and deals 450% damage. This one is up to you, as they both essentially fulfill the same purpose, keeping you in the air. You're harder to hit if you're moving around rapidly in the air, so why not just stay up there as much as possible? I'm a little partial to Whirlwind personally, as I think it is a tad more flexible than Rising Thunder, but either one will do you just fine. His utility skill is Blinding Assault, which is a quick dash straight forward that stuns and deals 300% damage. If you hit an enemy with it, you can use it again within 2.66 seconds, up to 2 extra times. So as long as you're actually hitting an enemy, you essentially have 3 charges of it. It's very good for keeping up damage, keeping you mobile, and keeping you hard to hit. I would say that the Mercenary's playstyle revolves around Blinding Assault in particular, as you'll likely be using it the most. On to his specials, the default to which is Eviscerate, which is another dash, but this time on contact with an enemy you're rendered intangible, and you attack them for 110% damage per tick. Eviscerate by default deals 7 ticks of damage, but it actually scales with attack speed. Eviscerate lasts 1.3 seconds, and you're invincible for another 0.6 after it ends, so it's just short of being 2 seconds of pure invulnerability. Also, like Flamethrower and Suppressive Fire, each tick of damage has a 1.0 proc coefficient. His alternate special is Slicing Winds, which is actually a projectile that deals 8 ticks of 100% damage on contact with an enemy, the last of which actually applies Exposed. While it might be tempting to have a ranged option, it's really hard to sacrifice Eviscerate. Even though I said Blinding Assault is at the core of his kit, Eviscerate is definitely the strongest part of it. Very high damage, very high proc rate, and vulnerability, and it just gets even better the more attack speed you have. It's really hard to pass up on it, especially when you factor in how hard Slicing Winds is to even unlock. Slicing Winds is fun, but Eviscerate is just far superior. Personally, I like to take Whirlwind and Eviscerate, and I've pretty much summed up why already. Despite the added risk of being a pure melee character, Mercenary manages to still be very powerful. Now we're on to Rex. Most of Rex's abilities have an HP cost, but he has very high innate self-sustain to compensate. He has some of the highest potential damage output in the game, as well as a nice cushion of healing to back him up, making him a very strong character. Rex's ability to tear through enemies early on is almost unparalleled. You do have to be careful, as it's easy to go overboard with his abilities before you get some extra healing, but Rex is very high risk, high reward oriented. First, he has a passive, which is a debuff on some of his attacks called Weaken. When an enemy is weakened, they have 40% reduced movement speed and damage, as well as a 30 armor reduction, which translates to roughly 23% increased damage taken. His primary attack is Directive Inject, which fires 3 projectiles that each do 80% damage, and the last projectile specifically applies Weaken and heals you for 60% of the damage. I'm going to skip ahead to his secondaries briefly, but I'll talk more about his primary in just a moment, and you'll see why. His default secondary is Seed Barrage, which launches a mortar directly where your crosshair is that deals 450% damage and costs 15% of your HP to use. But it has a mere 0.5 second cooldown. For reference, that is the shortest a cooldown in this game can possibly be. It cannot be reduced any further by Alien Head or even Brainstalks. His alternate secondary is Directive Drill, which works similarly to Arrow Rain in that it places a small AoE on your crosshair that deals 450% damage for 3 seconds. This has a 6-second cooldown, but does not have an HP cost. So, Seed Barrage is just better, and here's why. Not only is it just the strongest secondary in the game, the actual attack of your primary only lasts 0.2 seconds, but the full animation is 0.6 seconds. This animation can be cancelled by using Seed Barrage, meaning you can attack faster and mix the high damage output from Seed Barrage as well. And, as long as you're consistently hitting the third projectile and getting some health back, this combo becomes very spammable. This is where a majority of Rex's damage output comes from. Sure, Directive Drill is safer, but the sheer damage output that Seed Barrage adds, as well as Rex having plenty of self-sustain option to support spamming it, leaves it severely outclassed. His default utility is Directive Disperse, which deals no damage, but applies a knockback and weaken to all enemies hit, as well as pushing you backwards if you're in the air. His alternate utility is Bramble Volley, which is essentially the same skill, but instead of weakening, it actually deals 550% damage and heals you for 10% of your max HP for every enemy hit, and costs 20% of your max HP to use. In this case, Bramble Volley is generally better. Using this on a big crowd of enemies is an easy way to just instantly get all of your HP back. And with its high raw damage and 0.5 proc coefficient, it does a decent job clearing crowds as well. Finally, his special is Tangling Growth, which fires a projectile that, on contact, creates a large AoE that roots and pulls in any enemies in range for 8 seconds. You're healed for 1.5% of your max HP per second for every target rooted, and costs 25% of your max HP to cast. His special is another very useful tool for dealing with crowds, as well as giving you a very high amount of healing in the right scenario. Rooting also counts as a debuff, meaning Rex has 2 innate debuffs in his kit, which is really nice if you get a death mark with him. Speaking of items, as you'd probably imagine, I highly recommend avoiding taking anything that can give you shields. Because you'll be damaging yourself so often, you'll essentially just have a decent chunk of your max HP missing constantly while you're in combat. This would include stuff like shield gens, transcendence, and even Wake of Vultures sometimes. Brittle Crown is also not a very good idea, as you'd probably expect. Razor Wire, on the other hand, is incredible for Rex. Same goes for Nukahana's opinion. Enough about items. If you haven't guessed already, I always take Seed Barrage and Bramble Volley. As long as you're sustaining yourself consistently, the HP cost of these abilities is almost negligible, and the sheer amount of damage Rex can put out with them is almost unparalleled. Speaking of unparalleled, our next character is the Loader. Loader's movement is literally unmatched. She can move around and speed through maps faster than anybody else. She's a melee character, but she plays much more patiently than the Mercenary, as she can zoom in and unleash charge punches that deal insane amounts of damage. She's almost like an assassin in that regard, which is funny considering she's also a bit of a bruiser. It's a strange combination, but the result is very fun. I mean, she is my main after all, so I guess I'm a little biased. Regardless, let's actually take a look at her. First up, we have her passive, Scrap Barrier. Loader is immune to fall damage, and thank God, because she'd be terrible without that. And hitting enemies with her gauntlets gives you 5% barrier, like the Topaz Brooch and the Aegis. The barrier is a nice cushion to keep you alive while in melee range, but as you could probably guess, the real kicker is the fall damage immunity. Normally that wouldn't be a huge deal, but on this character specifically, you'd basically be dead constantly without it. Her primary is Knuckle Boom, which is a simple punch that deals 320% damage. That is all. Her default secondary is Grapple Fist, which fires your gauntlet out and latches onto enemies or terrain on contact and pulls you to them. Her alternate secondary is Spiked Fist, which works the same way, but it stuns, deals 320% damage, and pulls quote-unquote light enemies to you. Light enemies are things like beetles, lesser wisps, and even brass contraptions. And the quote-unquote heavy enemies are things like beetle guards, clay templars, and more obviously, bosses. As you could probably tell, Spiked Fist is essentially just a straight upgrade. Your secondary is half your movement. It essentially lets you swing around like Spider-Man. Just your secondary alone gives you so much freedom in movement, but it gets even better with her utilities. Speaking of which, her default is Charged Gauntlet, which charges up a piercing punch that will launch you directly forward and deals anywhere from 600% to 2700% at full charge. And it does even more damage the faster you're moving. Her alternate utility is Thunder Gauntlet, which charges a single target punch that deals a flat 2100% damage, but on contact deals 1000% damage in a cone behind the target. You also can't hold the charge with Thunder Gauntlet like you can with Charge Gauntlet, but the damage also does increase depending on how fast you're moving like Charge Gauntlet does. As loader, if your secondary ability is your bread, your utility is your butter. The punch is your main source of damage, and with all the momentum behind each punch, a major chunk of your mobility as well. When you combine your secondary and your utility, you can literally go wherever you want faster than anybody else. The sheer damage numbers you can reach with her punch are what gained her the reputation as One Punch Woman. Personally, I prefer Charge Gauntlet, but this one can go either way. If you don't like charging your punches long and just want to get the damage out faster, go for Thunder Gauntlet. But if you prefer the slower, more assassin-like playstyle of swinging in, punching through a crowd of enemies and swinging out, go for Charge Gauntlet. Either way is perfectly viable and will still net you good results. Oh, she also has a special, M551 Pylon. This throws out a floating pylon that damages up to 6 nearby enemies once every second for 100% damage. Pylon is nice for dealing with smaller and/or flying enemies early on that might be annoying to deal with, but other than that you won't really be using it much. However, you can actually hook onto it with your secondary. So if you're in a big open area and you just can't seem to find a decent spot to swing from, you can just make your own. Honestly, that's mostly what I use it for. Other than that, it doesn't really serve much of a purpose in her kit. Personally, I like to take Spiked Fist and Charge Gauntlet. Trust me, if you like movement in games, nothing quite compares to the level of mobility Loader has, and the skill ceiling is pretty high too. Next up we have our final melee character, everyone's favorite poison doggo Acrid. Now when I say melee, Acrid is actually a bit more of a hybrid. He has a melee-oriented kit, but he has ranged abilities in poison. He has 2 different playstyles depending on which abilities you choose. One is more melee-focused and the other is more passive, staying at a safe distance and letting your poison do most of the work. Either one is viable, as we'll see once we take a look at his abilities. Speaking of which, let's start with his passives, and yes, you heard me right, he has 2. His default, unsurprisingly, is Poison. Poison is a debuff that deals damage over time for 10 seconds. The damage it deals is either 1% of the target's max HP per second, or damage equivalent to Acrid's damage stat, whichever one is higher. So it deals at least 1% of the target's health per second. This might not sound like a lot at first, but it really adds up on the tankier enemies. Poison is also non-lethal, meaning it will always leave enemies on 1 HP. His alternate passive is Blight, which deals 60% damage per second for 5 seconds, but Blight can stack, which increases the damage per tick, and Blight can kill, unlike Poison. Blight sounds like it'd be pretty good, but due to how infrequently Acrid can apply it most of the time, Poison is usually better. If it worked like 1.0 Bleed does, and the duration of each stack was refreshed when a new stack was applied, it'd actually be really good for Acrid's full melee playstyle. But as it stands, currently Poison is usually just better, especially the later you go. Blight still isn't terrible, and I'd still recommend giving it a try with his melee build, but I don't find it to be as effective overall. His primary is Vicious Wounds, which is a simple melee combo that deals 200% damage on the first 2 hits, and the third deals 400% and gives you the Regenerate buff that heals you for 10% of your max HP over the next half second. Like the Loader, this gives Acrid some extra survivability in melee range. Due to his lack of iframes when compared to the Mercenary, he takes a lot more damage generally, so this sustainability is very welcome. His secondaries are really what determines the playstyle you're going to use. His default is Neurotoxin, which spits a projectile for 240% damage and poisons, and his alternate is Ravenous Bite, which is a quick bite that deals 310% damage and gives you the Regenerate buff. It also deals 2% more damage for every 1% HP the enemy is missing. So, as it sounds, if you want to go with a hybrid/deranged Acrid, stick with the default. But if you want to be fully melee based, go with the Bite. His default utility is Caustic Leap, which is a jump that slams on contact and stuns, dealing 320% damage and leaves a pool of acid that deals 25% damage per tick. His alternate is Frenzied Leap, which is functionally the same, but deals 550% damage and, instead of leaving a pool of acid, reduces the cooldown by 2 seconds for every enemy hit. Frenzied Leap also has a 10-second cooldown at base, while Caustic Leap has a 6-second cooldown, and they both have 2 charges at base. So this one is also not very cut and dry. They're both pretty good, but it really depends on what you're doing. Frenzied Leap is worse strictly for movement purposes due to the longer cooldown, but if you're using it for damage, you only need to hit 2 enemies to have the same cooldown, and any extra enemies hit reduce it further. Personally, I think Caustic Leap is better for the hybrid playstyle, and Frenzied Leap is better for melee. Finally, his special is Epidemic, which is a projectile that on contact will spread to nearby monsters and deal 100% damage and apply poison. Any enemies hit by it will spread it to other enemies in range, up to 20 enemies max. Epidemic is really good for shooting into a crowd and letting the poison wear them down. Each time it spreads to a new enemy, it also has a 1.0 proc coefficient, making it an even better source of crowd control when paired with sufficient items. So, as I've explained, which abilities you take are dependent on how you want to play Acrid. If you want the passive hybrid/range style, take his default skills. And if you want to play the more aggressive melee style, take his alternates, excluding Blight. Acrid does either one pretty well, so pick the one that interests you more and have fun playing the Poison Doggo. And finally, we have seemingly everybody's new main, the Captain. The Captain's playstyle revolves around putting out a huge amount of damage while having some utility beacons to support him. It's hard to deny the sheer amount of damage this guy can put out. It's pretty nuts. When it comes to rapidly bursting down tanky enemies, Rex is basically the only character that can really hold a candle to him. He's also got access to an array of support beacons to beef him up even further. Now he sounds pretty nuts as is, which he kind of is, but he doesn't have any movement abilities, so he's rather vulnerable. But, as a wise man once said, who cares as long as you can kill everything before it kills you? First up we have his passive, Defensive Microbots. If you've watched my 1.0 items video, you should be familiar with this already, but for those of you unfamiliar, the Captain always spawns with this legendary item that will straight up delete enemy projectiles. On top of that, any drones you buy, including drones from the backup, also have defensive microbots. And the rate they shoot down projectiles scales with their attack speed. Defensive microbots are insanely helpful, especially on a character as vulnerable as the Captain is. This also makes things like healing drones particularly helpful on him. Just keep in mind if you scrap or print them, you can't get them back. His primary is the Vulcan Shotgun, which is a bit of a shotgun sniper hybrid that you can charge before firing to narrow the spread, making it very effective at any range. It fires 8 bullets that each deal 120% damage, and each bullet has its own individual 0.75 proc coefficient. Vulcan Shotgun has a really good damage output, really good flexibility because of its range, and a very high proc rate. I don't think it's unreasonable to call it the best primary in the game. It also has a lot of knockback, so you can just fling things like elite lesser wisps across the map. His secondary is Power Taser, which is a fast projectile that deals 100% damage and shocks enemies. Shocking is essentially like stunning an enemy, but they remain stunned for 5 seconds unless they take more than 10% of their max HP as damage. The taser isn't super amazing on its own, but it can be used fairly well offensively or defensively. If an elderly Murian is running up on you and about to shoot you, just zap him real quick. Or, alternatively, zap an enemy and line up a good shot on them with your shotgun. Or even better, use it in tandem with your utility skill. Speaking of which, his utility skill is Orbital Probe. Using it activates a targeting mode where you can target up to 3 probes to drop down and impact shortly after that each deal 1000% damage and stun. Because of the delay, tasing an enemy and then targeting them is a good way to confirm the hit. So you can see where the ridiculous damage output I mentioned previously comes from. Between the probes and his shotgun, you can tear through enemies like crazy. Also, each probe has a 1.0 proc coefficient. Just saying. Finally, we have his special, the beacons. He has 4 different beacons, which you can choose any combination of 2, and you can use each once per stage, meaning you have to be a bit strategical with your placement. So what do his beacons do? His first is a healing beacon, which heals all allies in range for 10% of their max HP per second. His second is a shocking beacon, which will shock all enemies in range once every 3 seconds. His third is a resupply beacon, which upon interaction fully resets the cooldown of your equipment. His fourth and final is a hacking beacon, which will slowly hack all purchasable interactables in range to a cost of $0. While all of them have their uses, the hacking beacon is by far the best one. It's basically at least one free item. Using it on a clump of chests will open all of them. Or even better, using it on a Shrine of Chance to make each used cost nothing to guarantee you get 2 items. You can even hack the guaranteed legendary chest on Abyssal Depths or Sundered Grove. The hacking beacon is immensely helpful for speeding up your run. The healing beacon is probably the next best one. Having that cushion is very nice early on, but its usefulness starts to fall off in the mid to late game. The resupply beacon is nice, but it becomes more and more redundant the more items you find to reduce your equipment cooldown. And finally, the shocking beacon is just too small to really be that useful, especially when you can only use at most 2 per stage. It's going to ultimately affect a very small portion of the stage. Personally, I recommend just taking 2 hacking beacons, but 1 hacking beacon and 1 healing beacon isn't a terrible option either. Either way, go and enjoy this complete Chad of a character. So there you have it, a complete overview of every survivor and their abilities. If there's a character you've yet to give a chance, now's the time. Like I said before, they're all very much viable and very different in playstyle, so choose the one you think you'll have the most fun with. I'd say my top 3 right now are probably Loader, Captain, and Engineer. If you guys enjoyed this, let me know if there's anything else you'd like to see from me. Right now, the only thing that I've got in mind is a general gameplay guide, so if you've got another idea or you'd like to see that, let me know in the comments. And I do apologize for how long this video took to put out. Part of it has been me being really busy dealing with some IRL stuff, and the other part admittedly was me just being lazy. I know I've said this several times already, but I do genuinely appreciate all the support from you guys recently, and it means the world to me. If you've seen the couple of streams I've done recently, I'll be trying to keep those up every now and then, but for the time being I don't really have a consistent schedule. With all that said, I'm bad at outros. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in another video. Finally, his special is Tangling Growth, which fires a projectile that, on contact, creates a large AoE that roots and pulls in any enemies in range for 0 seconds. Whoa, what? What? Excuse me, did I script that wrong? Well, I know it doesn't last 0 seconds, but... How did I not notice that? What is it? It's 10 seconds, right? No, it's 8 seconds. Okay. How the hell did I put 0 seconds? And how did I not notice that? Okay, whatever.